Hi, John.
Can you check? Can you see if he's muted?
I'm checking. You're unmuted, I take it.
He just unmuted.
Flip. One hot moment, John.
John, just give us a minute.
We're working on it.
I owe everyone kind of a more detailed message and explanation.
Fixing it right quick. All right, John, would you say something for us?
I wonder if he took his earbuds out.
No, he didn't. He didn't. They're on. You know what we're gonna do? We're gonna do this the old-fashioned way. Let me count my speakers.
Hold on, John. Bear with us. Oh, there we go. John, keep talking.
Yeah, okay, I will do.
Okay, great.
It'll do.
Okay,
Okay, we can hear you. We have not started yet, as you can see.
good. I'm gonna put you on mute.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Okay, just minimizing a video, John. That'll be good.
You'll see. I mean, it's
Hi, John.
Hi, Cindy, how are you?
I'm good. Our panelists want to say hi to you.
John, I think if you want to pipe in, you'll pipe in.
Well, I will do whatever I'm directed to do, but I thought I would listen to the already scheduled.
Well, if I say something wrong, correct
Then I
me.
will join in at the end. I'm going to listen throughout so that I have some better context and better understanding of what you're doing.
Sorry.
Do you hear, you know Sean?
Hi, I'm Sean.
I did not know. How are you?
Good.
I would guess that we could have a separate panel discussion about what necessarily is it interesting history on your part, but to talk about something
Thanks for joining us today.
Okay, so you see the people in the audience, do you, John? You see them? Just wave or say something.
Jill with, board president, at CRC, that's right. I remember.
Hi, John. Down single. How are you?
we haven't seen each other in quite some time.
Yeah.
And of course, in that time, absolutely nothing has changed.
Everything's changed. I can't, it's, you know what, it's gotten kind of loud here, I can't hear you, so hopefully we can hear a second, so nice to see you.
I get chills because my parents. He's the son of a mathematics professor at MIT. Chelsea's my best friend. It's easy with me. You can get to that is Leader for the Dallas.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Temple-Tifereth Israel. I'm Roger Klein, one of the rabbis here at the temple, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this program this afternoon. This is the second of two programs on the Ukrainian situation and its implications. The first one last week at the Ukrainian Museum and Archives, where our people saw something about the history and the culture of Ukraine and the long history of the Ukrainian migration to Cleveland. Today we're honored to have a distinguished panel to talk about Ukrainian history, the Cleveland connection, and how we can be supportive of the war effort. I've been asked to say a few words of Torah and then to try to think about some of the larger issues that we're facing. You know, one of the fascinating things about the Hebrew Scriptures is that though it is the history of a particular people, Abraham and Sarah's descendants, once we get to chapter 12, that's what we're dealing with. But an interesting question, it seems to me, is why is it that the Bible doesn't start with Abraham? After all, Homer's Iliad starts with Achilles and Agamemnon. The Aeneid of Virgil starts with Aeneas leaving Troy. Why, since this is a history of a people, of a family, doesn't the Bible proceed right to them? And I think the answer is something like the following, at least for me. God, according to the Bible, calls a particular people in order to cultivate their own culture and religion and values and ideals, but with the important foundation that through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. The first 11 chapters of the Bible deal with what we might call universal history. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel, in which God is trying to find a felicitous, powerful, positive relationship with humanity. It's only when this project runs aground that God feels that God ought to find another vehicle, and that is to call Abraham, Sarah, and their descendants as a vehicle for a universal idea and aspiration that all peoples shall in some way become one and recognize that they, all of them, are children of one God. And each has value. And so the Bible's focus on one family is for two reasons brought to prominence. And that is for this one people to develop itself, but also to recognize that our mission is not to be insular, but to try to bring a universalist idea of humanity to bear. In that regard, I do want to talk a little bit about the situation in the Middle East today. And the first thing I want to do is to read a paragraph from Nicholas Kristof's op-ed piece in this morning's New York Times. These are the first couple of paragraphs. No one understands terrorism more viscerally than Ma'oz Inan. His 78-year-old father and 75-year-old mother were among those massacred by Hamas this month in southern Israel. He mourns his parents, and he despairs for old friends who have been kidnapped by Hamas. Yet he also fears that the unbearable losses his family endured are now being used to justify an impending ground invasion in Gaza. I don't stop crying, he told me, in the hostel he runs here in Tel Aviv. I'm crying for my parents, I'm crying for my friends, I'm crying for those who have been kidnapped, I'm crying for the victims on the Palestinian side, and I'm crying for all the victims that are going to suffer. A mirror, it seems to me, in 3 paragraphs of the Bible's fundamental message. We cry for our own, but we cry for everybody. And in that sense, I want to read a couple of verses from Psalm 122 with some additions of my own. Pray for the well-being of Jerusalem. May those who love you be at peace. May there be peace within your ramparts. May there be life and peace among Israelis and innocent Palestinians, all of whom are children of God. For the sake of our kin, I pray for the well-being of all. I seek their good. Psalm 122. Let me turn the floor over now to Ann.
My name is Etty Benin, and I'm one of the co-chairs of this event with Candy Anchor and Linda Post sitting here. Welcome. I wanted to introduce our speakers. And Sean Martin in the center is going to be the moderator. He serves as a curator for Jewish history at Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland. He is also part of curatorial staff at Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage. He is the co-editor of Cleveland Jews and the Making of the Midwestern Community. He is an author of Stitch and Tie, the Cleveland Garment Industry and Jewish Life in Krakow in 1918-1939. And he is an author and editor of For the Good of the Nation, Institutions for Jewish Children in Interwar Poland. On his left is Mr. Andrew Fedinsky that we recently met at the Jewish Museum. He's a graduate of the University of Notre Dame. He told us that he was born in this place at Person Camp in Austria. He attended the Leopold Franzen Universität, Innsbruck, Austria. He is a winner of Fulbright Scholarship to Germany in 1969, and in 1980 got an MA in History from John Carroll University. I'm sorry I don't cite a long list of your accomplishments, but it's a very impressive list. He is currently a director of the Ukrainian Museum and Archives in Tremont. And Lisi Shapiro, who most of us know well, she is practically a member of the Temple. She is a regional director of AJC Cleveland. And I just wanted to say a couple of sentences about AJC. AJC is a Jewish advocacy group established in 1906. It is one of the oldest Jewish advocacy organizations, and according to New York Times, it is widely regarded as the dean of American Jewish organizations. As of 2009, AJC envisions itself as the global center for Jewish and Israel advocacy. Lisi is a regional director at AJC. Welcome and thank you very much for agreeing to be on this panel. Please go ahead and start.
Before you start, can I just say, I am not the original director because some of you here know Marty Plex, who was here for years and many years. We've been in Cleveland for 80 years, so I clearly.
Way too young for that.
Thanks so much, Etty. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people here and to have the chance to talk to all of you. Etty, could we also acknowledge John Dunn on the Zoom?
I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce John Dunn on Zoom. He is a member of our congregation. He is very active in helping Ukraine. Only this year he has performed, he went to Ukraine 3 times, delivering medical equipment, supplies. He received an award from the Cleveland Association of Physicians this year, and he received an award in Ukraine for his volunteerism. Thank you, John, and he will be kind of commenting and speaking.
We could all use the mics because John's having a little bit of a hard time hearing.
Okay, thanks so much. And we've got, I think
Can you hear us, John?
Yeah, I can't hear you, and greetings to everyone, including the good fathers who are very much in my view. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there in person.
Thanks so much for joining us. I really wanted to start by just offering a few words of historical background, really sort of briefly, which is a challenging thing to do because it really is 1,000+ years of Jewish history, Jewish heritage in these lands that we call today Ukraine. But let me start first, actually, by suggesting some broader themes that I'm talking about and telling a very short story about myself. So I was teaching in Krakow for a semester in 2019. I was fortunate enough to teach for a semester at Jagiellonian University. And during that semester, I wanted to travel some. And so I decided that I wanted to go to Kiev. And I went to Kiev for about 5 days over the May holidays in Poland. And I mentioned that I went to Kiev because it's a wonderful city. I was glad I had the chance to be there. It was very good timing for me to go. But I mentioned that because after February 24th, 2022, I would no longer say Kiev, I would say Kyiv. And that really is a difference, right? And I'm saying that really as somebody who has studied East European history, who has spent a lot of time reading about nations and nationalism and national identity and spelling and pronunciation of terms that people prefer to be called, etc., right? And I just simply accepted our Russianized English version, Kiev, right? And then February 22, and we are saying Kyiv in Ukraine is playing a different role in our lives. And so partly what we're talking about is the emergence of Ukraine overall in many different ways, and our new understanding really of Russian imperialism and how it has affected all of us over these centuries. Okay, so now the very quick overview of 1,000 years of Jewish history in these lands that we call Ukraine. So the Jewish presence in these lands really does go back about over 1,000 years ago. We're most familiar really with the migration of Jews from Western Europe to Eastern Europe from about the 13th century on, when there are larger and larger populations of Jews in these territories at that time. Ukraine, of course, Ukrainians have their own population, their own history on these lands, and we are always, really pretty much anywhere, but I would say, perhaps especially in this region of Eastern Europe, we are talking about we can choose our term, multicultural, multi-ethnic place. an international place where groups of different people who have different linguistic traits, different cultural habits, different religions are living together. And that is certainly the case in this region. One early flashpoint of difficulty in relationships between Jews and Ukrainians, the 1648 Khmelnytsky uprising against the Poles, in which about half of the Jewish population is massacred at this time. This is a difficult flashpoint in this relationship, right? We flash forward through the periods of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, speaking of imperialism, and the period of Ukrainians really not governing themselves. We have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for several centuries. We have the period of the partitions, and we have the Russian Empire until the fall of the Russian Empire during World War I. We have the violence of the pogroms in these areas from the 1880s on, especially in the 1880s. We have the violence that follows World War I in 1918, and pogroms especially between 1918 and 1923 as boundaries are being sorted out. Of course, we also have the formation of the Soviet Union in 1917, the subjugation of Ukrainians to the Soviet Union, the development of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic around that same time too, and we have Ukrainians themselves spread between an independent Poland and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And of course, we have the very difficult history of the rise of Nazism in the 1930s in Germany and World War II and the Holocaust in 1945, a history of Ukrainian perpetrators, and also a history of wonderful acts among Ukrainians as well during this very difficult period. And we have the persistence, of course, of the Soviet Union in the territory that we call Ukraine until the emergence of an independent Ukraine in 1991. And so, before I get to my questions, just one last thing. When we're talking about Ukrainian Jews then, we're really, in my estimation, we're talking about Jews who are living in an independent Ukraine, but that means from 1991 on. We might need to revise our thinking about that, but terms mean something. And if you look at the history of this period, we're talking about Polish Jews and Russian Jews who are living in places that are in today's Ukraine, right? And they're called Polish Jews and Russian Jews because they were Polish Jews and Russian Jews. Poles were governing this territory. Russia was governing this territory. And Jews, the minority, were assimilating to the group with more significant cultural power, right? After 1991 in this territory, that becomes Ukraine. And so when I was thinking about even maybe things that I might recommend for people to read, I thought of a very important, very dense 3-volume history of the Jews of Poland and Russia. Most of that, of course, is in Ukraine. Okay, but it really is talking about Polish Jews and Russian Jews. Okay, so with all that in mind, let me start asking questions. I have a question really just for Andy to start. I'd like to just ask Andy if he could just summarize briefly the current state of the war in Ukraine.
Well, I have a mic. Does this work? Yeah.
Let's pass one mic around to the other.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Much better, okay. Lacey brought this to the Ukrainian Museum about a year ago. AJC, American Jewish Committee, stands with Ukraine. The war started, as Sean indicated, February 24th, 2022. This is a 2-page ad from the Plain Dealer from a couple of weeks ago, and it's in alphabetical order, so the first one is Senator Sherrod Brown. We're here towards the end with the letter U, Ukrainian Museum Archives, and the United Ukrainian Organizations of Cleveland. So this event, which Eddie organized and others, was planned before October 7th and Hamas's attack on Israel. And now we're in it together. President Biden will be introducing a measure to support both Israel and Ukraine, and it's given the 1,000-year history of our two peoples, it's really astonishing that the fate of these two peoples are so bound together, and we have common enemies. Hamas is getting its weapons from Iran to attack Israel. Russia is getting its weapons from Iran to attack Ukraine. There are two countries in the world that I'm aware of that have a Jewish president. One of them's Ukraine, and you can guess what the other one is. So the war, it was expected, not just from the Kremlin, that Ukraine would collapse within days. The Russian soldiers packed dress uniforms with the expectation of having a victory parade in Ukraine's main boulevard, Khreshchatyk, and Putin, no doubt, intended to come and announce triumph that the two nations are together. And I want to follow up on what Sean said about nomenclature. When I was growing up, you talked about the Ukraine. And this Ukrainians find offensive. We are not the Ukraine, we're Ukraine. Now, why is this article considered offensive? Well, according to Putin and many, many Russian ideologists, Ukraine as a separate nation, as a separate country, does not exist. It's the Ukraine, part of Russia, much as the Midwest or the Great Plains are part of the United States, much as the Outback is part of Australia, much as the Yukon is part of Canada. While Ukrainians have aspired for their independence, they were independent. If you go to KU, you'll see 1,000-year-old churches, and not just in KU, but throughout Ukraine. You'll see not quite as old, but you'll see many centuries old synagogues, mosques. And Ukraine today is in many ways similar to the United States in that you not only have Ukrainians, you have Jews, Crimeans, Poles, Greeks, etc., who now identify with their country, and so there are Muslim Crimean units of the Ukrainian army. There's a Jewish unit of the Ukrainian army where they combine the Ukrainian trident and the Star of David. And Ukraine is a free country, civil society, free press, elections that people honor, and so on. And so what was supposed to last a week is now into almost 2 years. And Ukraine has been showing extraordinary courage, and we've been enjoying American support, NATO support, and so on. There was a general who came to the museum the other day, an American, Green Beret, who had just been on the on the Eastern Front. He said it's horrific, but he's convinced Ukraine's going to win. And with the support of our Congress, people like yourselves, like us, and now in cooperation with our two communities, I believe that we will win. And it's a battle for the identity, for this existence of Ukraine, much as what Israel is now fighting for, its existence as a separate, independent, free country.
Thanks so much. I'd like to turn to Lisi now with another question. How would you characterize the response of Jews in Ukraine to the war? And what is the need among the community for increased advocacy for assistance?
Good afternoon, thank you. I want to first acknowledge the fact that we are gathering at this most difficult time for both of our communities. And I would say either Saturday evening or Sunday morning, among the first calls that I received.
Please, because I cannot hear.
Okay, there you go. On that fateful Saturday or perhaps on Sunday, among the first calls that I received were from our Ukrainian friends. And it was just, we're thinking about you, we're praying for you, and we're sorry. Much the same way, the sign that Andy showed you, we had made for the very first vigil in which I was asked to speak that happened 2 days after the war started. So we are bound in this together. So there is a Jewish community within Ukraine. There is a federation, if you will, the Jewish Confederation of Ukraine. AJC has had a very strong relationship with them for many, many years. It's my understanding that since the war began, approximately 15,000 Jews from Ukraine made Aliyah. Another 10 to 15,000 have left for Europe, some temporarily and some probably for good. A handful have come here. We know that there's a young woman who is the young professional Jewish woman who we had the privilege in Cleveland of knowing, and she came to our global forum. She brought a group of young professional Jewish folks, I think it was probably 10 years ago, to be with us. She and her family moved to Berlin, and we had her in Israel this past year. And it was so good to see her because after about 6 months of radio silence, I was able to get her to Israel and to be with us. As Andy said, many of the Jews in Ukraine are a part of the war effort. They are supporting it, they're fighting, and so forth. However, there are many Holocaust survivors and elderly who are still there and who have great needs. The joint is on the ground there. AJC has made 2 substantial grants to the community since the war began. And I think at some point we will talk about the ways in which we can actually help Ukrainians here and there. The advocacy is really important. And we have done joint advocacy together, our 2 communities, with our elected officials, and we have done it separately to make sure that we keep the Ukrainian war in the forefront of our legislators' minds and for the necessary funding. We are fighting the line of democracy, and we're doing so in shared aspiration and value, and we can't forget that piece. I think it's important to note that since 1991, the Jewish community has supported Ukraine's desire for independence. And I think we need to just address a little bit up front here about anti-Semitism. Prior to 1991, there was quite a bit of anti-Semitism. After 1991, there was some anti-Semitism. It manifested itself in a traditional way. It was in government, it was in society, it was especially, as it is today, in university. And that began to subside in the mid-2000s. And why did it begin to subside? It began because the Jewish community itself matured. It was organized through the Jewish Confederation of Ukraine, and it became strong, and Jews began to thrive in an independent Ukraine. At the same time, there was a maturation of Ukrainian society and a democratic process. It further diminished, as Andy said, when Zelensky became president, and even furthermore since the war has begun. There are other pieces to this that we'll get to, and there's one fear that should Ukraine lose, that the Jews might be scapegoated for it, but we're not going there because we don't think they're going to lose. So I guess we'll talk more about that as it comes along.
Thanks. What I like about both comments really is that they are emphasizing when Andy says we are in it together, and then Lisi really brings out that really it is a fight for democracy, and that's what we're caring about, and that's why it makes it a fight for us here in the United States as well. I think that's just really important to stress. I have another question that I'd like to address everyone in the group, and maybe we start with John Dunn. And John, feel free to answer this question specifically, or just to make comments on what you've heard. I wanted to ask that question about, really about the sign that Andy pointed out. The question is about the sense of solidarity among Jews worldwide for Ukraine that I think we saw in February 2022, just as the war broke out. Why do you think we saw that support? It hasn't always been the easiest of relationships between Jews and Ukrainians. And so it really is very meaningful when in the first service after the war in Ukraine, I think must have been that first weekend of March, I think at St. Vladimir's, Lisi was there and Lisi was a speaker. This is really quite powerful. So let me open it up for all of you, but if we could start with John, if you'd like to comment on anything that you've heard or on that question specifically, that'd be great. Thanks.
A broad question. I'll try to answer as efficiently as I can, and I count on Jen Mendelson to stand up and wave her hands aggressively if for some reason my audio is not functioning as it should. First of all, I'd say, although I've made, as already been noted, 3 trips to Ukraine this year and 3 trips to Poland last year to engage in various humanitarian efforts. None of them involved the Jewish community. In fact, I didn't find the Jewish community, the official bodies of the Jewish community very open to volunteers like me. So I went purely as an outgrowth of my own curiosity and interest in being involved. I have, over the course of time, both in Poland and in Lviv in particular, connected with the Jewish community there. So I don't know that I have any experience-based special expertise to give a point of view about the Jewish community in a broad sense. I would say that Ukrainians and the good father sitting there will be able to give better testimony to this than I could ever do. Welcome assistance and outpourings of support and sympathy and empathy from anybody in the world. I don't think they were probably surprised to see a major effort, a visible effort at least, on the border in Shemish and across the crossing at Medeka by the Jewish community. I don't think there was anybody who probably was surprised to see an Israeli flag. Although, obviously, the irony of seeing people leaving Ukraine for the comfort of Poland under a Jewish banner was that was pretty rich. But now, I think, based upon my contacts with the Ukrainian community in general, I'm talking about on the ground in Ukraine, and with the Jewish community there, which is principally through my connections with Hillel, I would say we're all Ukrainians now, is sort of the point of view. I'm talking about the Ukrainian mentality as opposed to the diaspora, although that may be the case too. There's no time to talk about differences, just as there isn't in Israel right now. It is all hands on deck and all shoulders to the wheel. And I think that no one is, so far as I've experienced, trying to draw any distinctions between Ukrainian Jews and other Ukrainians. And that also is the point of view that I get from the two Ukrainian Reform rabbis, one of whom was resident in Kyiv and the other is from Lviv and is in Jerusalem finishing their rabbinical studies at HUC, with whom I have regular contact both now in Israel, both servicing the Ukrainian diaspora, mainly in the Haifa area. Does that answer your question, Sean?
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's great. Thanks. Other comments to this question about solidarity and...
So I think that because there was such support in the Jewish community starting in 1991 with independence and the right to independence, that during the Maidan Revolution in 2014, HAC actually opened up an office for 6 months in Kyiv to not only work with the Jewish community, but with the non-Jewish community as well. So when Russia attacked in February of 2022, the tyrant Putin invades Ukraine, and we had to express, in our kishkas we knew that we had to express our unwavering support for the sovereignty, for the independence, and for the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And again, it was because that attack was against our democratic values that we hold so dearly, and that we as Jews know what happens when democracy is threatened and a rule of law disappears. So our collective history makes us natural partners in this. We're fighting evil, and in doing so, again, of those common values and aspirations. So we began to garner support. And it was support. I was truly honored at that vigil that we've spoken about. Senator Portman was a speaker. Marcy Kaptur, Representative Kaptur was a speaker. And I was a speaker, along with clergy. And it was really powerful for us to not only have been asked, but to have been there. And we began the process of support, monetary support, the support of helping those who wanted to leave Ukraine, whether it was those HAC along with Federation and others chartered planes for Aliyah, but at the same time, we had people on the borders, and we were meeting people and taking them from the border into Warsaw and Krakow. And so we continued to do that, and then we joined the community here in, not only in the rallies, but in helping the refugees who were coming, in the medical supplies that John has been so active in. And so it was a natural you mentioned it about evoking that solidarity. It seemed very natural.
May I make an unsolicited public service announcement?
Of course.
And that would be based upon my experience with various components of the Jewish world over the years, and in particular since February of 2022. There is no question that the single most effective organization in advancing the legitimate interest of Ukraine in the Jewish world has been the AJC.
Thank you.
And that's a combination of not only their excellent field work on the ground over many years in Ukraine through Sam and others who are certainly involved, but even more so by their diligent, full court press in close cooperation with numerous representatives of the Ukrainian community in North America. It's really impressive. It is something that is commented on by every member of the Ukrainian diaspora that I deal with. In fact, I find it really quite funny. Many of them don't know that there is such a thing as a Jewish Federation or a Joint Distribution Committee. When they think of the Jewish world, they think only of one institution, and that's the AJC. So hats off to Lisi and everyone else in the crowd and in cyberspace who's involved in supporting the AJC activities. That was unsolicited and uncompensated.
And much appreciated. I'd like to take us back, not 1,000 years, but to the beginning of the 20th century, when Ukraine was partitioned between the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire, and Jews were marginalized in the Russian Empire. They were not allowed to live in what is today Russia. They lived in the Pale of the settlement, so that whoever says they're descended from Russian Jews, they lived in what is today Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, or Lithuania. When World War I broke out, there was a general mobilization among all the countries of Europe, including the peoples of Ukraine. There were Ukrainian soldiers on the Austrian side, and there were Ukrainian soldiers on the Russian side. And as our friends from St. Vladimir's know, Ukrainians celebrate Christmas on January 7th, not December 25th. That may change now. But on January 6th, on Christmas Eve, Austrian and Russian soldiers were singing Ukrainian Christmas carols. And then the next day went back to killing each other. And the question was, why are our young men killing each other? And the answer is, because we don't have a country of our own. And so for the balance of the 20th century, that was the aspiration of Ukrainians, was to have an independent country. As for Jews, in the Russian Empire, there was a group called the Black Hundreds. Their slogan was, "Save Russia, kill a Jew." And that was the result that resulted in pogroms and so on. And the Jewish population had the same question. Why are we being persecuted like this? Because we don't have a country of our own. And that was one of the major impetuses for Zionism. And of course, Israel became independent in 1948, I believe. Ukrainians fought throughout the World War II, and then afterwards for their independence, and then of course that came about in 1991. And what's interesting, Lisi talked about anti-Semitism. Well, historian Timothy Snyder wrote a very, very important book called Bloodlands, where he described Central and Eastern Europe's, with Ukraine at the center, as bloodlands. And World War I resulted in tens of millions of deaths. In 1932-33, there were millions of Ukrainians who were deliberately starved to death in the Holodomor, the artificial famine which Stalin organized. Will be commemorating the 90th anniversary of that in November. And of course, the Holocaust resulted in 1 million Ukrainians killed, and of course, 6 million throughout Europe. In the Soviet Union, both of these genocides were suppressed. You couldn't mention the Holodomor. You couldn't mention the Holocaust. The first crime, Nazi crime of the Holocaust, was in KU at Babin Yar, where tens of thousands, 35,000 or so Jews and others were massacred. There was no monument to that. There was no mention. The poet Yevgeny, I forget his last name, Yevtushenko, he had to self-publish about that. One of the very first acts of independent Ukraine was to build a monument to Babin Yar and memorialize this. Our own Tarash Magala from Cleveland, a very good friend of mine, and a number of you, I'm sure, he represented the United States. He went there on, I think it was Air Force One, when they...
Andy, I don't know where you are positioned vis-a-vis the microphone, but I can't hear a single word saying.
I'm speaking right into it. Yeah.
If you're still talking, I'm not even sure if you're still talking.
So, I don't know what the... do you hear now?
I can hear your voice, but not articulated words. So keep going. Let's not get this far back.
So anyway, what's at stake, as I mentioned before, is the results of this effort. And when the war ended, wise people in the United States and in Europe said, what do we do to make sure that these catastrophes don't happen anymore? And what happened? We created the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, World Court, NATO, the United Nations, and a global architecture that respects borders, human rights, international law, and that's what's at stake now with Putin's invasion of Ukraine and more recently, well, not just recently, but throughout Israel's existence, is their effort, diplomatically, politically, militarily, to maintain their independence, and our mutual independence and freedoms and so on. So there's a long, long history that goes back, and that's what's at stake today with our mutual efforts to restore global order. And it's, as President Biden said, we're at an inflection point. The world is going to go in one direction or in another direction, for good or evil, based on the outcome of what's going to transpire in the next months and year.
Thanks so much, really, for calling attention to some of the events of the past And I want to just kind of follow up on that briefly, because it's just worth mentioning that it is these past events that I think influence us, of course, even if we're not always aware of that. So of course, I'm really, we have a legacy of genocide in this region, as we all know. We have the Holodomor, the famine perpetrated by the Soviets in the 1930s against the Ukrainians. And of course, we have the history of the Holocaust, the murder of the Jews of Europe by the Nazis and other perpetrators from other groups as well, from 39 to 45. And I think that in some way, our knowledge of those events, of course, informs our perspective. I don't have I was going to ask a question about that, but kind of in the interest of time, I will ask the panelists that they can certainly address how their awareness of these events has affected their work. I want to just mention and recommend the work of Father Patrick Dubois. There's a book called The Holocaust by Bullets, and what Father Dubois did in that book was he wrote about his investigative research in Ukraine recently, within the past 10, 20 years, to determine how the Jews were killed. And in doing that, what he also uncovers is what this history of genocide meant for the Ukrainians as well. And it's a very powerful book, and a reminder, I think, also of why Jews should be especially cognizant of their heritage in this region. I have just a couple last questions. A question about cooperation here in Cleveland, and a question about advocacy, and a question about recent a question invoked by the recent attack on Israel. So you can address that question about the Holodomor and the Holocaust and legacy of genocide, but I also want to ask a question about the long relationship between Jews and Ukrainians here in Cleveland, about how this cooperation developed, and what were the challenges, how that relationship changed over the decades.
All in one.
All in one.
All in one, okay. Look, I think that we live our history. The Holocaust is part of who we are and the way we present ourselves. It is, as has been mentioned, over 1 million Jews perished in the region that is now Ukraine. There were people who took part in that. There were also over 2,000 Ukrainians who have been designated as righteous among nations, meaning that they also worked to help the Jews. So while we can unequivocally condemn the actions during the Holocaust, we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again, and we do that through outreach and education. At the same time, what we need to be cognizant of today is we need to make sure that within Ukraine there is not a glorification of those heroes or those who were seen as heroes who also participated in the atrocities, and to recognize guilt. We're working to improve the lives of Ukrainian Jewish community and the Ukrainian non-Jewish community. We have to work against the propaganda that Russia has calling Ukraine Nazis, and using that in propaganda as recently as in Canada. And so we have to do all of that. But the history of our relationship here is really very interesting, and it started with a member of this synagogue, Marty Plax. So for those of you who know Marty, I had the privilege, I called him the other day just to make sure that I had this history right. And the relationship was truly forged during the time when John Demyanjuk was identified or misidentified as Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka. There was an uproar of press in both communities. It was a lot of bad press. And Marty, who was my predecessor, reached out to Marta's father, Bill, and said, would you have a meal with me? Would you have a drink with me? And Bill said yes. And he said, let's meet at Nate's. And so they met at Nate's, and they continued to meet, and they continued to meet. And I can say that from that, we have relationships that are generations long and decades deep. And what Marty said to Bill at that meeting at Nate's sealed the deal of a friendship that's complicated, but a friendship that has evolved. And it was, nobody's pain is worse than anyone else's pain. Nobody's pain is worse than anyone else's. And it was from that the relationship really bloomed, and we worked at it, and we worked through things, and we continue to have just an amazing relationship with the community, as evidenced by the way in which we showed up when you were in pain, and the way in which you have shown up as we are in pain.
Yeah, I'll talk about Marty in a moment, but this whole story, history, is for many of us personal. And Lisa indicated that there are over 2,000 Ukrainians who are designated as righteous. You know, the penalty for helping Jews was death. And there were a lot of Ukrainians who were executed precisely for that. And it is personal in my family. If you go to Google and you type in Priest's Grotto, P-R-I-E-S-T-S Grotto, it indicates that the entrance to Priest's Grotto is in the Ukrainian village of Strikiuchi. My mother grew up in Strikiuchi, and she talked about the caverns that stretch for 100 miles from Strikiuchi all the way into Ukraine. Her brother was the village priest, Ukrainian Catholic priest. And if you read about Priest's Grotto, it says there were several Jewish families that sheltered there throughout the war, and they were getting food and water from the villagers. Now, my uncle, who I never met, he knew more secrets than anyone else, because people would come to confession. And without violating the secrecy of the confession, he knew that the Nazis were going after the Jews in the cavern. And he would send little boys, tell them they have to move from there to elsewhere. One of the righteous is the beatified, saintly Andrei Sheptytsky, who was the Metropolitan in Lviv of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. The Vatican did a study back, 25 years ago. What did Pope Pius know about the Holocaust? And they determined that Bishop Sheptytsky told him about the Holocaust in Ukraine. But not only that, that Bishop Sheptytsky wrote a letter to Heinrich Himmler telling him, don't recruit my people to do your evil deeds. Not only that, he instructed his priests, a couple thousand of them throughout Ukraine, to deliver a sermon titled, Thou Shalt Not Kill. And my mother told me...
So may I bring a little of that into current times?
Sure, so let me just finish. My mother said that her brother, she said, the village priest, that he delivered that at the risk of his own life, because that was a crime, according to the Nazis. So there's a lot of focus on perpetrators. I think we need more focus on the benevolent side of this. John, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, well, I just springboard from that to say the following. I have developed, during the course of my visits now, a very close relationship with the Ukrainian Catholic University called UKU in the vernacular of the Ukrainians in the Ukrainian diaspora. I've given a number of talks there during times that I've been in Lviv. There is no question about the fact that the current management and administration of UKU understand fully that their origins with Bishop Shepetsky, who was the founder of UKU, and his dedication to the cause of saving Jews was and remains a central message of UKU, and indeed that explains in part why they have an important Jewish studies program. UKU happens to be the most Western and maybe one of the most important universities in Ukraine, especially now since it's in Lviv in the west of the country and it's a relatively safe place. If you go to the house in the center of Ukraine, or center of Lviv, where the Jewish institutions, the Joint and the Jewish Agency, to the extent it was ever active in Lviv, and Hillel and other organizations are centered, you'll see a wall of pictures telling the story of Jewish history in Lviv, and Bishop Shepetsky gets about 4 pictures on the wall, which is a very small wall, which shows you how importantly the Ukrainian community, Jewish community, regards his contributions. So it's a story of history with a very current theme that plays out on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks so much for mentioning that important history.
And I just make one other comment about, I have no credentials to match those of Andy and you, Sean, or even Lucy to talk about the historical issues we've been addressing. But again, if I can just bring it right to the moment and talk about my experiences as recently as now 2.5 weeks ago, when I actually left Ukraine 2 weeks ago yesterday. I was in the square outside of my hotel in Lviv on Saturday morning, attending the daily ritual in Lviv, which was the military funerals that are held in the cathedral. That particular day was a day of a very moving day because it was a triple funeral of 3 brave defenders who collectively reached the age of 70 when the news of the terrorist attacks began to unfold Saturday morning in Lviv. And I think that when you talk about the Holocaust and the Holodomor and what people's memories are, again, I can't speak to that with any authority, but what I can tell you is that in my experiences, limited as they may be in Lviv and in Kyiv, I have been amazed to run into a number of Ukrainian ancestry Jews young people who made Aliyah, and after they had completed their IDF service and began to get involved in their business careers, mostly in the tech world, they came back to Ukraine. And they didn't come back just to Ukraine, they came back to Lviv, which has become sort of a tech hub, again, especially since the outset of the war. And 2 very brief vignettes about that to show they thought they felt safe enough to go back to Ukraine. They didn't think about any of the historical legacy that people talked about in negative terms. They thought there was a life to be had for them, and they preferred to live that life in Ukraine versus Israel, even though they made Aliyah. Now, one of those brave young men who I did not meet, but I met his widow and his 2 kids. She was Israeli. She came back to Ukraine with her husband. And given his IDF service in the first months of the war, he volunteered and was butchered by the Russians within a matter of months. And she has decided to make her life in Lviv with her 2 kids. And one of the other guys that I met, Nick, I actually spoke to him Monday after the terrorist attacks, while they were still ongoing actually, because he'd been back in Israel to celebrate holidays with his family. And guess where they lived? They lived in Sderot. And he was recounting to me on that Monday morning when I spoke with him his real-time account of what it was like to be in a safe room, which apparently in their case was safer than some other safe rooms were, as the terrorists came in and started to fire away inside their house. Blessedly, he and his parents were not harmed, at least not physically, but of course, like everyone else in the world, has been assaulted and more emotionally by this. So that was trying to bring some of this right into the current moment.
John, thank you so much for that. You've really already given an eloquent response to my next and kind of last question, which was just about how this new war in Israel has affected your understanding of the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians, whether in Ukraine, the United States, or in Israel. And also, let me just go ahead and combine this with my question, really also about advocacy, as a final question. If you could address your current thoughts, given our new situation with the attack on Israel, but then also really what you really would like to tell the audience about how we can support this community in Ukraine.
Well, let me take the last part of that first. I listened to a call yesterday with somebody whose name might be familiar to any of you who follow the Hartman Institute from Jerusalem and its outstanding programming, Yehuda Kurtzer. And he was talking about his experiences having just come back from Israel, where he was during in the aftermath of the terrorist attack. And he made a comment that really reflects my own experiences in Ukraine, and that is, people are so delighted to have you there, to demonstrate your support in the flesh, regardless of any of the geopolitical considerations. And so just giving that sort of direct emotional support is really vital to the advocacy effort. And in that vein, any of you who would ever be so inclined to take a trip to Lviv, it's really easy to do, and it's safe as far as I'm concerned. That's based upon current circumstances, and you could go there as a tourist, even if you only focused on Jewish history in Lviv, remembering that there were 150,000 Jews who lived in Lviv before World War II, and you would find a rich treasure trove of Jewish history to explore. In the Old Town, the synagogues, the cemeteries, the mezuzahs that are still on the door next to the Armenian Quarter, in the area that was called Jewish Wall Street. And it is really a rich tapestry of Jewish history in that part of Ukraine. On the broader front, I think Ukrainians from the very first moments of absorbing what was going on in Israel and understanding the scope of it were terrified that the U.S. and other of its supporters would be forced to the cruel decision of, I can give a gun here, or I can give a piece of ammunition here, or I can give it there, but I'm not likely to be able to do both. It's yet to be determined whether that's the case, whether those choices will have to be made. But they're, I think, concerned about that and concerned with good reason. Insofar as the broader advocacy effort is concerned, I think just look at the Ohio congressional delegation. And I don't mean to get into Lee C's territory, but there are lots of people in that delegation, starting with one of our senators, who I will not name, who seems to think that you can draw a distinction between Israel and Ukraine when it comes to the morality of what's going on. And I just would say, to not define what an appropriate advocacy is, as horrible, as horrifying, as blood-curdling as what has happened in Israel from and after October 7th. That's going on in the Ukraine every day. We worry about hundreds of hostages, including elderly and children, that are now hidden in the labyrinth of tunnels in Gaza. There are thousands of Ukrainian babies who've been kidnapped. And I don't see a lot of people who are highly focused on getting those kids back.
John,
I think the other aspect of that is Ukrainians are worried that, quite apart from the logistical side of can the West support us in the way that it has and support Israel as much as it will need, there's just the general view that people are already worn out with our war now, almost 2 years into it, the attention span of Western civilization being what it is.
John, I'm going to jump in.
How are people
I'm going to try to jump in.
and at the same time giving Israel the attention it will deserve and demand?
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Sean?
Yes, thanks. Go ahead.
Hi. So, October 7th has changed our world. It is different. This is not a skirmish between Palestinians and Israelis. This is an unbearable, unbelievable terrorist act by Hamas, a terrorist organization backed by Iran. Our worlds have been shaken, much the way our friends' worlds were shaken a few years ago in February. I don't know that, Sean, that it has changed the way I feel about our relationship. I think that it is stronger again. That very first day, one of the very first calls I got was from Marta. How am I? What can she do? And that has continued. Andy Fute, who is the national chair, put out a statement that was very strong immediately. In terms of advocacy, what John is talking about is true. President Biden has put forward, as you likely heard last week, a very large package of funding, and funding for both Ukraine and for Israel. In that very large package, 10 is for Israel, and it's a huge package. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge package. What we need to do is to advocate for the passage of that bill. When it hits the floor, there will be challenges to it. There is division within our delegation. We will work together and separately to do it. In addition to that, and Etty and Jen, I don't know whether or not you're still helping with refugee families that are here in Cleveland. You are.
Refugee Response and other associations.
That is still very important here. There are still Ukrainian emergency funds. As you know, there are Israel emergency funds, all of which are giving 100% of those donations into both countries. So advocacy, dollars, and above all, a little bit of love and prayer.
Yeah, I would echo what John and Lisi said. We just had a meeting at the Ukrainian Museum 2 days ago with the head of the German Marshall Fund, and she's an American, former State Department official, how important it is to support Ukraine, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it's in America's interest, and it's in the interest of global security, global infrastructure. So by all means, contact our representatives. Senator Sherrod Brown was represented there. Congressman Max Miller, who traces his heritage to what is today Ukraine, he was represented. We've reached out to Senator J.D. Vance to try to meet with him and, just try to give him our perspective. He hasn't responded to that. So we just keep trying. I mean, there are representatives, and they need to hear from us. And yes, there's great need to support refugees and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Helena Zatkar is here from the Cleveland Maidan Association. They've raised over $2 million and have been sending ambulances and humanitarian aid and so on. Dr. Mahai, he's working with Cleveland Maidan. I know the Ukrainian Orthodox Church globally has been working with that. So the need is ongoing, and both political and materially. And I think the fact that you're here, you don't need to be persuaded. And I know that, I'm tired. We have something going almost every day. And there are people sacrificing so much, including their lives, as John pointed out, and as we all know. So for as long as it takes, let's keep plugging, and as I started, we're in it together. Our two communities, and it's not just for the Jewish and Ukrainian communities, it's in the interest of the world.
And if I could just draw on one other point.
Just very quickly, we're about to wrap up here.
Advocacy effort. Yes, it's not just because it's the right thing to do to support Ukraine. It is definitely in America's interest, in the interest of anybody who has a desire over the long term to see an independent, free Western Europe. But the other thing that I think is a bogus argument that I hear is, well, the Americans, they're doing it all on their own. Hooey. That's just not true. When I get on the ground in Lviv, I am amazed by the dozens and dozens of countries that are represented in the volunteer groups that I connect with. And to end on perhaps a more humorous note in that connection, on 2 occasions now, I've met a Scottish group called Jeeps for Peace. And these are a bunch of Scotsmen whose drawl is so hard I can't understand more than 50% of what they say. And every 2 months, they bring a caravan of donated and purchased Jeeps and pickup trucks. They drive across Europe from Scotland. They fill the pickup trucks and the vans with medical supplies and other humanitarian aid. and they drive across the border, and they deliver them mostly to the Ukrainian defense forces at a base outside of Lviv. And to make sure that they maintain a low profile when they go out on the street in Lviv, they insist on wearing their kilts. And if I can tell you one bit of advice, you never want to go out drinking with a group of Scotsmen who are in Lviv for the night while they're wearing their kilts. That's really to be avoided. And hopefully I'll remember that the next time I run into them.
Thanks so much for all your comments and your questions. I've really learned a lot from the discussion. Etty, I don't know if you feel we have time for questions.
If you have a question for the speakers, please stand up, introduce yourself, and ask that question. We didn't get the English stuff.
It's not a question, if I may comment. And I know the rabbi had a few words. I feel like I'm a member of this temple. I was here for a bat mitzvah. I was here when Rabbi Cohen Jonathan invited us. Our parish received a sympathy, a sympathy after the beginning of the war, and I acknowledge that. Our choir came here to sing last February. I watched every one of your holy services. I fell in love with the Yom Kippur. I said to Rabbi Klein, we should do it every month. I said to him, we should do it every month. He said, we should do it every day. It's true, and the Ukrainians here don't know what I'm talking about. I have celebrated Passover for over 20 years. A member of your temple is a beloved friend. She comes to our Christmas Eve on January 6th. During the COVID, she gave me Hadasha. I think that's the pronunciation. And my daughter and my wife and I had a Passover at home. And we sang, Dai, Dai, Dana, Dai. I come from a small northeastern Pennsylvania town. Coal miners. We had one Jewish boy, Clark Mark. When he was invited to the party, the host bought a special pot to cook because it had to be kosher. When I went to New Jersey, the first parish, do you know what the Vanek-Jackson bill is? You do? Okay. All these Jewish people are walking around the church with their big hats. Do the Ukrainians know what that bill is? That's right, that's right. There was a famine in the Soviet Union. They turned to the United States to sell them wheat. And the political leaders, Vanek and Jackson, said, okay, we'll sell, but you got to let the Jewish people out. And they came to New Jersey and New York. They changed the whole area. We had 300 families. Most of them were for Ukraine. And they fell in love with the church for one reason. The Gold Dome. It reminded them of being in Ukraine. My connections all, please stand up, Jim. He and I talk about movies in our bathing suits. I'm not you can imagine what I look like in a bathing suit, but he's doing a marvelous job for you.
I keep silent.
Okay. Now, of all the Ukrainians here, I'm the only one that has the third generation. My family came in 1902. My father was a staff sergeant in the Second World War in Europe. His two brothers, he only had two brothers, no sisters. They were also fighting against Hitler. When I came to New Jersey, the best thing I could ever have was a Jewish doctor. Because I would pull out the money and he would say, professional courtesy. I I don't think the doctors know what that word means today, professional courtesy. Dr. McLeod, do you know?
I do it all the time.
I'm sure you do. Now, where am I going with this? First of all, Mr. Dunn, if you could hear me.
I can, yes.
Extremely touched with your words, your kind words. In the middle of your suffering, the suffering of your people, you said such kind words about Ukraine. Truly. You have a beautiful heart that you can see the sufferings of both people. And during this time, it's a little bit hard because all the attention is gone away from Ukraine, and people are dying every day that we don't hear about. But there's one big difference between the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel. Do you know what the difference is? Anyone take a guess? After the war began in Ukraine, there were no demonstrations at all supporting Russia. Nothing. Nothing. How heartbreaking it must be for you to live in this country, to see the signs that they're carrying in the cities and in the universities. Absolutely mind-boggling. And my heart bleeds for those people who are suffering in Israel and those who are suffering here and have to look at these people from the river to the sea. So I just want to say on behalf of our clergy that we appreciate so much what you have done to help Ukraine. At the same time, we understand your suffering. And there was one final thing. A number of years ago, our church sponsored trips to Israel. The prime bishop of our church, he was the best man in my marriage and godfather of my son, he called and he said, "John, you want to go to Israel? All expense paid." I said, "Sure, why not? I have a passport." Preparing to go on that trip, I came down with very, very serious back problems, I ended up in a Hillcrest Hospital. God bless that surgeon. The therapist came in. She was from Odessa, Jewish, Ukrainian. She spoke fluent Ukrainian. I said, "How is it that you, living in Odessa, a very Russified area, speak Ukrainian?" My father said, "We live in the country, we should know the language, Ukrainian." I couldn't go on that trip. All expense paid, I couldn't go. 2 years later, he called again. "John, you want to go on this trip?" All expense paid. I had open heart surgery. Couldn't go. He's never called me again. And I don't think I want a third operation either. So anyway, may God bless you, and I'm thankful for all of you for having this afternoon for our communities.
Any more questions or comments?
Hello, Dr. Taras Malay. I'm going to be short. I hear Father all the time, so I know, keep it short. We had a very good panel today. I really appreciate it. And a lot of good thoughts that were discussed. I just wanted to add one more thing. We're going to win this war, Israel and Ukraine. The question also, we have to start planning how to keep the peace. So that's all I wanted to add. We have to keep the peace.
Any more questions, comments?
Can I ask one more thing? For you people to educate us, they say there is an increase in anti-Semitism in the country. Can you please give us examples what you have experienced?
You know what?
How much time do we have?
We'll talk.
I think that's
That's a separate.
Civil regulation. Every kind of sector.
There is absolutely, there was prior to October 7th, an increase in anti-Semitic incidents across our country. On tomorrow is the 5th anniversary of the attack of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where it was the deadliest anti-Semitic act in our country. 11 worshipers were killed, were murdered on a Shabbat morning. 6 more were injured, and a community is in trauma. That was a clarion call for American Jews to understand that anti-Semitism is on the rise here in our country, and we have seen it. There are so many examples, including what recently happened at Beechwood High School in a football game with another community's team, where the play at call, the scrimmage line, was Nazi. So we are fighting this. We know that any time that there is an incursion or a war in Israel, anti-Zionism morphs into anti-Semitism, and we are facing it. I would be more than happy to have a conversation with you about it, but we could speak for hours on it, but it is across every sector of the community. President Biden earlier this year announced a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. AJC has a task force that is making sure that those things are happening, but it is across every sector. What we are seeing today is a huge amount of anti-Semitism on college campuses, but it is across it's everywhere.
Thank you for the question.
If I may add that a lot of the demonstrations you were talking about on college campuses, under the guise of they are saying anti-Zionism, anti-imperialistic aggression of Israel, this is very closely anti-Semitic motives from there. So, and you saw Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, everywhere. So, anybody else wants to? Okay, please feel free to take your questions. And if you can stay for some time just to mingle and talk, you're welcome to. Thank you. Oh, thank you very much for our panelists. This is really very, very, we appreciate, and we have